It was the first day of winter in New Zealand, Monday, June 21st, 2004. A quiet, gray morning settled over the industrial suburb of Mt. Roskill in Auckland. For most, it was just another work day. The streets were busy with traffic. School children made their way to class, and the hum of the city carried on as usual. But for one man, Jim Donnelly, that morning would mark the beginning of a mystery that has haunted his family, his colleagues, and investigators for 2 decades. Jim Donnelly was 43 years old, a husband, a father of 2 young children, a respected process engineer working at the Glenbrook Steel Mill, one of New Zealand's largest and most complex industrial operations. Known to his friends and family as quiet but brilliant, Jim had built a career around solving difficult technical problems. At work, he was admired for his expertise and his methodical approach to challenges. At home, he was a steady, reliable presence his family could depend on. Nothing about his life suggested danger. Nothing about that Monday suggested tragedy. But by the end of the day, Jim would vanish without a trace. His car was left parked in the lot at the steel mill. His personal items would later turn up in strange and unsettling locations. And yet Jim himself, his body, his voice, his presence, was gone. When Jim Donnelly failed to return home that evening, his wife Tracy felt an unease that grew with every passing hour. This wasn't like him. He wasn't a man to simply disappear, to abandon his responsibilities, to leave his children wondering where their father had gone. Tracy contacted police, and the search began. But what followed was not clarity. It was confusion. Each discovery only deepened the questions. What happened to Jim Donnelly on June 21st, 2004? Did he walk away from his life? Did he fall victim to a tragic accident? Or was something more sinister at play? This is a story of a man who vanished in plain sight, a mystery that has lingered unsolved for years, despite exhaustive searches, appeals to the public, and the lingering hope of his family. Tonight, we dive into the case of Jim Donnelly, the engineer who went to work one morning and never came home. On the morning of June 21st, 2004, Jim Donnelly left his home in Auckland like he had so many times before. He was dressed for work, carrying himself with the same calm, deliberate manner his family was used to. At 43 years old, Jim was a man of routine. He lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and his days followed a predictable rhythm. Wake early, drive to the Glenbrook Steel Mill, spend long hours immersed in the technical demands of his role as a process engineer, and return home in time for dinner with his wife and 2 children. That morning, nothing seemed unusual. No words of warning, no lingering look that hinted at something amiss. Jim said goodbye to his wife, Tracy, climbed into his car, and drove away. By all accounts, he arrived safely at the mill. His car was later found parked in the company lot, exactly where he would normally leave it. His presence was confirmed at the site, though accounts differ on whether anyone saw him directly after he entered. What is certain is that at some point during the day, Jim Donnelly vanished. The first sign that something was wrong came later that afternoon. When Jim failed to return home, Tracy began to worry. Hours passed, and the silence grew heavier. She tried calling, but there was no answer. Jim wasn't the type of man to simply lose track of time. He was meticulous, reliable, dependable. By nightfall, Tracy knew something was terribly wrong. She reported her husband missing. And from that moment, a mystery began to unfold. Police were called to the steel mill, and a search of the ground began. His car was still there. Inside were his belongings, giving no indication of plans to leave. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of foul play at first glance. It was as if Jim had simply walked into the industrial labyrinth of the mill and never walked out. As the hours stretched into the next day, search efforts expanded. Colleagues were interviewed. The steel mill's sprawling site was combed over and over, but there was no trace of Jim Donnelly, a man who left his home on a cold winter morning and simply disappeared. In the days following Jim Donnelly's disappearance, the Glenbrook Steel Mill became the center of a tense and desperate search. Police, firefighters, and even Jim's own colleagues combed through the sprawling facility. The mill was a dangerous place, an endless maze of machinery, furnaces, pipes, and industrial noise. If Jim had suffered an accident, The environment itself could easily have hidden the evidence, but the initial search yielded nothing. No blood, no signs of a fall, no indication that Jim had been injured within the site. His car remained untouched in the parking lot, locked, as though waiting patiently for its owner to return. Then came the first discovery, an item belonging to Jim. Found inside the mill, it seemed to suggest he had moved deeper into the complex that day. A second item was uncovered days later, raising more questions than answers. Why would Jim leave his belongings scattered in different places? Was he disoriented? Was he being followed? Or were these objects left deliberately, a kind of breadcrumb trail that led nowhere? Theories began to swirl. Some believed Jim may have suffered a mental breakdown. Friends described him as intelligent and deeply thoughtful, but also under immense stress from his work. Could he have wandered into the mill and taken his own life in one of its hidden chambers? Yet if that were the case, why had no body been found? Despite exhaustive searches, others whispered about darker possibilities. The steel mill was an industrial giant, and rumors circulated of dangerous workplace politics, pressures, and even potential conflicts. Could Jim have stumbled into something he wasn't meant to see? Could foul play have been involved? Police kept their official statements cautious. They could not rule out suicide. They could not rule out an accident. And they could not rule out homicide. Every option remained open, and every theory seemed to collapse under the weight of missing evidence. Jim Donnelly's family, meanwhile, lived in a nightmare. Tracy pleaded for answers, for any clue to explain how a man could vanish from his workplace in the middle of the day. Their two children struggled with the sudden absence of a father who had always been present, steady, reliable. By the end of the first week, hope was fading. Search teams had scoured the mill inside and out. Helicopters surveyed the surrounding areas. Dogs had been brought in to track his scent. But there was nothing, not a single trace of Jim beyond his abandoned car and the few scattered items found within the mill. It was as though he had been swallowed whole by the place. For Tracy Donnelly, the days after Jim's disappearance felt unreal, like living inside a nightmare that refused to end. She replayed every detail of their last morning together, searching for something she might have missed. Jim had been quiet, yes, thoughtful as though preoccupied, but nothing suggested he was planning to leave, to vanish, to walk away from his life and his family. And yet, the silence of his absence was impossible to deny. Tracy pressed the police for updates, but the answers were always the same. No new evidence, no body, no explanation. She turned to the media, pleading publicly for anyone with information to come forward. Flyers with Jim's face were distributed. The story reached the headlines in New Zealand, sparking public fascination and unease. The fact that a man could disappear from a steel mill, one of the most controlled, heavily monitored workplaces in the country, baffled everyone. Workers at Glenbrook began to talk, their theories ranging from tragic accidents to corporate secrets no one dared to name. Some insisted Jim had been struggling under enormous pressure at work. He had been a process engineer, responsible for the kind of technical oversight that carried serious weight. Had he cracked under that stress? Had he simply walked away, leaving behind the chaos of his job and the responsibility of family life? Others found that theory insulting. Jim was devoted to his children. He was the kind of man who showed up, who carried the burdens placed upon him without complaint. To abandon his family without a word was not in his character. As the weeks passed, the Donnelly household filled with questions no one could answer. Tracy tried to shield her children from the worst of it, but how could she explain what had happened when she herself had no explanation? How do you tell two young children that their father left for work one morning and never came home? Not because he chose not to, but because no one can say where he went or why. Every night, Tracy sat awake in silence, staring at the phone, waiting for a call that never came. Every knock on the door made her heart race with hope, followed by crushing disappointment. The house, once full of Jim's steady presence, now felt cavernous, haunted by absence. And still, no new evidence emerged. Police expanded their search to nearby forests, rivers, and remote roads, but each lead collapsed into nothing. The mystery of Jim Donnelly's disappearance was no longer just a family's tragedy. It was becoming something larger, an unsolved riddle that captured the attention of an entire country. As the weeks dragged into months, one thing became clear. Jim Donnelly had not simply wandered away. Something had happened to him on June 21st, 2004. Something powerful enough to erase a man in broad daylight from a workplace full of colleagues. Whispers began to spread around Glenbrick Steel Mill. Some workers believed Jim had been the victim of an accident, perhaps a fall into dangerous machinery or exposure to something toxic that had been quietly covered up to protect the company. The steel mill, after all, was not just an employer. It was a cornerstone of New Zealand industry. A scandal could devastate reputations, even economies. Others whispered of secrets Jim might have uncovered in his role as a process engineer. Was there something he knew? Something someone wanted buried? One colleague suggested, Jim wasn't the type to let things slide. If he saw something wrong, he would have spoken up. It was a chilling possibility. Had integrity cost him his life? But the theories didn't end there. Some pointed fingers closer to home. They questioned whether Jim had been struggling more than his family knew. Depression, exhaustion, hidden financial burdens. If he had taken his own life, why had his body never been found? Tracy rejected those ideas outright. She insisted her husband had shown no signs of giving up. He loved his children. He had responsibilities he never would have abandoned. The speculation only deepened when Jim's belongings were discovered scattered in unusual locations. Days after his disappearance, his wallet and other personal effects were found in areas far from where he should have been. The items didn't paint a picture of a man carefully planning his escape. They looked more like breadcrumbs, deliberate or accidental, left behind in the course of something gone horribly wrong. For investigators, each new clue raised more questions than it answered. Why leave his car in the lot? Why vanish without withdrawing money? Without contacting anyone? Without even taking the essentials a man would need to survive? And if Jim had been harmed, who had the means and the motive to make him disappear without a trace? As police tightened their focus on the mill and its secrets, the story of Jim Donnelly began to take on a darker shade. It was no longer just about a man who had vanished. It was about what might be hidden in the shadows of one of New Zealand's most important industrial sites, and how far some might go to keep those shadows undisturbed. For Jim Donnelly's family, the days after his disappearance blurred into weeks and then into years. The police investigation trudged forward, but each new lead seemed to collapse under its own weight, leaving Tracy and her children suspended in a cruel limbo between hope and despair. Tracy took on a role no one asked for, the tireless advocate, the public voice for a missing man. She spoke with reporters, gave interviews, and demanded answers when officials fell silent. Every word carried the weight of her grief, but also the iron determination of a woman who refused to let her husband's story vanish as suddenly as he had. Someone knows what happened to Jim, she told a local paper, and until we find him, we will never stop looking. The story captured the attention of the public. Newspapers published headlines asking, "Where is Jim Donnelly?" Radio stations ran call-ins, speculating whether the engineer had stumbled upon corporate wrongdoing or if his disappearance was linked to something more personal. Talkback callers debated theories late into the night. But while the media attention brought visibility, it also came with painful consequences. Rumors spread easily. Some accused Jim of running away, abandoning his wife and children. Others painted him as unstable, incapable of handling the pressure of his job. For Tracy, these accusations cut like knives. She knew her husband. She knew his love for his children, his pride in his work, his devotion to their life together. To suggest otherwise was to erase the man she had loved for more than a decade. As anniversaries of Jim's disappearance came and went, the family marked them not with closure, but with vigils, appeals, and quiet moments of remembrance. His children grew up with questions that had no answers. Birthdays, graduations, milestones. Every event was haunted by the empty chair that should have been filled by their father. At the heart of it all was Tracy's unyielding belief that Jim had not simply walked away. "He would never leave us," she repeated time and again. Not willingly. Something happened to him, and somebody knows what. Her persistence kept Jim's case alive in the public eye. But it also meant the family lived in a state of constant reawakening, reliving the trauma every time a new headline appeared. Every time a false lead promised answers and then collapsed. The spotlight brought attention, but it did not bring resolution. And as the years stretched on, the mystery of Jim Donnelly's disappearance only grew darker, more perplexing, and more painful. As time passed, the unanswered questions surrounding Jim Donnelly's disappearance began to take on a life of their own. With little in the way of confirmed facts, speculation filled the vacuum. Some theories were whispered in cautious tones, others screamed from headlines, each one attempting to explain what could have happened to a man who seemed to vanish without a trace. The first theory was the simplest, and, for many, the least believable, that Jim had walked away, voluntarily, that he had chosen to abandon his family, his career, his entire existence. Supporters of this idea pointed to the stress he had been under at work, the pressure of his demanding role as a process engineer. But for those who knew him best, this theory collapsed under the weight of his character. Jim was loyal, devoted, anchored to his wife and children in a way that made the idea of voluntary disappearance impossible to reconcile. The second theory was darker, that Jim had been the victim of foul play, silenced because of something he knew. Some colleagues whispered that his role at the plant had exposed him to sensitive information, knowledge of safety issues, financial misconduct, or practices that someone might have wanted buried. Had Jim uncovered something so dangerous that it cost him his life? The thought chilled those who dared to consider it. Then there were the rumors that stretched into conspiracy. Claims that Jim had been watched in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, that he had spoken of feeling uneasy, of sensing something was wrong. Unconfirmed reports suggested his car, left in the parking lot, showed no signs of forced entry, as though he had willingly met with someone he trusted or feared. Other theories ventured into even more unsettling territory. Was Jim targeted by someone outside of his work? Could his disappearance have been random, an opportunistic crime committed by a stranger who happened to cross paths with him that morning? Or was it something more personal, rooted in a secret few, if any, had ever known? The absence of answers fed the fire. Every new rumor carried its own gravity, dragging Jim's family deeper into a vortex of speculation. Each possibility was terrifying in its own right, but none were as devastating as the truth they all avoided, that Jim might never be found, and the person or people responsible might never be held accountable. For the public, the theories provided a framework to keep the story alive. But for Tracy and the children, they were salt in an open wound, reminders that behind every headline was a family left to navigate a nightmare without end. And yet, even to the storm of speculation, one fact remained unshaken. Jim Donnelly did not simply vanish. Something happened to him on June 21st, 2004. Something deliberate, something sinister. For detectives assigned to Jim Donnelly's case, the challenge was unlike any they had faced before. On the surface, the scene was almost insultingly simple. A car parked neatly in a lot, a man reported missing, and not a single obvious clue pointing to what had happened next. The early days of the investigation focused on routine procedure. They retraced the steps on the morning of June 21st, interviewing colleagues who had seen him arrive. Jim's car key, still in the ignition, raised questions. Had he planned to leave it? Or had he been interrupted before he could lock the vehicle? His wallet and personal belongings were still inside. For many investigators, this detail stood out most. People do not walk away from their lives leaving behind everything they need to survive. Forensics combed the vehicle, but the results offered little hope. There were no signs of a struggle, no fingerprints that couldn't be explained. The car was clean, too clean, some argued, as if someone had taken steps to erase whatever story it might have told. Detectives also sought out surveillance footage from the area, but in 2004, security cameras were far from ubiquitous. The gaps in coverage left wide stretches of time unaccounted for, blind spots that might have captured Jim's final moments, or the person who approached him that morning. Meanwhile, cadaver dogs were brought to the scene. They searched the grounds of the company facility, scoured nearby wooded areas, even followed trails that led into the remote periphery. Each time, hope flared in the investigators' eyes. Each time, the trails went cold. The search for answers soon extended beyond the company grounds. Rivers, lakes, and rural stretches outside the city were swept with boats and helicopters. At one point, divers plunged into waters suspected to hold grim secrets. And yet, the silence was absolute. The earth, the water, the wind all withheld the truth. As weeks turned into months, leads dwindled. Investigators faced the brutal reality of working a case with no crime scene, no body, and no suspect. They had fragments, a note from Jim to his wife left days before, hinting at pressure he was under, witness statements that contradicted each other, odd reports of strangers spotted near the facility. But fragments alone cannot form a whole picture. Public pressure weighed heavily. Tracy and the children begged for answers, appearing before cameras, holding back tears as they pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. The police echoed the call, but behind closed doors, they admitted what they feared most. The trail was slipping away. It was as though Jim Donnelly had been swallowed by the earth itself. A man who lived, who worked, who loved his family, gone, with only questions left in his wake. For Jim Donnelly's family, the days after his disappearance were not measured in hours, but in heartbeats, in moments of unbearable silence, in the dull ache of waiting for a phone call that never came. His wife, Tracy, became the reluctant face of the search. Standing before reporters, she spoke with a steadiness that belied the storm inside her, insisting that Jim was out there somewhere, that someone, anyone, knew what had happened to him. Her appeals resonated across New Zealand. Volunteers joined search efforts, pinning posters to lampposts, plastering Jim's face across townships and rural roads. Community halls buzzed with whispered theories. Some believed he had been abducted. Others whispered of foul play tied to his workplace. A darker few speculated that Jim had simply chosen to vanish, unable to bear some hidden burden. But those who truly knew him, the man who kissed his children goodnight, the husband who promised Tracy he'd be home for dinner, refused to accept that theory. Jim Donnelly was not the kind of man to abandon his life. As weeks stretched into years, Tracy's fight only hardened. She attended every police update, pressed every official for answers, and reminded the media again and again that this was not a cold case, but a family torn apart. Her words were clear. Someone out there knows what happened to Jim. And yet, no breakthroughs came. Time eroded leads, blurred memories, and dulled urgency. What had once been nightly news was pushed aside by fresher headlines. But for the Donnelly family, there was no moving on, only enduring. Their home became a place of haunting absence. Every empty chair, every unclaimed jacket, every unopened letter, a cruel reminder of what had been stolen from them. Tracy held on to his belongings, refusing to let go, refusing to allow the world to erase him. The community, too, carried the weight. Each year that passed without answers deepened the unease. How could man vanish so completely, in broad daylight, leaving behind not even a trace? How could justice remain so elusive? It is in these lingering shadows that the true horror of Jim Donnelly's disappearance lies, not only in the mystery itself, but in the way it has forced his family to live suspended between hope and grief. Nearly 2 decades have now passed since the morning Jim Donnelly walked into his workplace and vanished without a trace. His car remains in the parking lot, a silent witness. His belongings, scattered across time, speak only in riddles. And his family, they remain trapped in a story without an ending. For investigators, the case is a wound that never closed. Files grow dusty, but the questions remain sharp. Was Jim the victim of a crime meticulously concealed? Did someone inside or outside his workplace know more than they revealed? Or was his disappearance the result of circumstances so unthinkable that no one has yet pieced them together? For the Donnelly family, the absence of answers is its own form of cruelty. Every birthday, every anniversary, every milestone is haunted by the empty chair at the table. Tracy Donnelly has often said the hardest part is not knowing whether to grieve or to hold on, not knowing whether the man she loved is out there somewhere or gone forever. The police, the media, and the community still use words like unsolved and disappearance, but for Jim's loved ones, those terms fall short. To them, it is not a case. It is a father, a husband, a man whose life was taken from them in the most bewildering way possible. There are moments, even now, when new leads are whispered, when someone swears they heard something, seen something, remembered something, and every time, hope flickers. Every time, the Donnellys are pulled back into the possibility that at last, the truth might emerge. But time and again, silence follows. As the years pass, one truth grows harder to deny. Unless someone steps forward, unless hidden evidence comes to light, Jim Donnelly's story may forever remain a mystery, an open wound carved into the history of a family and a community. And so tonight, as we step back from the timeline and look at the fragments left behind, one question lingers above all. How could a man vanish so completely? And how many people must know the answer, yet remain silent? Jim Donnelly's disappearance is more than an unsolved case. It is a reminder how fragile our grip on certainty truly is. And until the day comes when truth is spoken, his name will remain a haunting echo, carried in the voices of his family, in the unanswered questions of investigators, and in the shadows of a mystery that refuses to die.